Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Harvard Institute of Politics. My name is Matteo Cagliero. I'm a sophomore at the college studying computer science, and I'm a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Student Committee. Before we begin, please take a moment to locate the exit doors, which are located on both the Park and JFK Street side of the forum. In the case of an emergency, please walk to the exit nearest to you and congregate in JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate Camila Cruz.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Institute of Politics. My name is Camila Cruz, and I am a junior at the college studying social studies and philosophy. I am also a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Tonight, we have the distinct privilege of hosting a conversation with our distinguished guest, Federico Sturzenegger, Argentina's Minister of Deregulation and State Transformation. Federico Sturzenegger is a distinguished economist, academic, and policymaker, widely recognized for his contributions to economic policy in Latin America. He earned his PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has held academic appointments at prestigious institutions such as UCLA and the Universidad Torquato di Tella, where he has been a leading voice in public finance and monetary economics. Sturzenegger is perhaps best known for his tenure as president of the Central Bank of Argentina from 2015 to 2018, where he played a central role in efforts to stabilize inflation, modernize monetary policy, and increase transparency in the country's financial system. His career also includes legislative experience as a member of the Argentine Congress, as well as work in the private sector and multilateral organizations. Sturzenegger continues to influence economic discourse in Latin America and beyond through research, policy advising, and public engagement. This conversation will be moderated by Jeffrey Frankel, an economist and professor here at the Kennedy School, where he teaches courses on international economics and macroeconomic policy. He holds a PhD in economics from MIT as well, and is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Frankel served as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Bill Clinton, where he worked on fiscal and international economic issues. His research focuses on exchange rate regimes, monetary policy, international capital flows, and global commodity markets. Frankel has published extensively in academic journals and has contributed to policy discussions through his involvement with international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Bank for International Settlements. He also writes regularly for policy platforms and serves on advisory boards related to global economic governance. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Federico Sturzenegger and Jeffrey Frankel to the forum.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to elaborate a bit on the introduction for Federico Sturzenegger because I think his background, his experience is extraordinary. He's done at least six different things, almost six different occupations, and I can't think of another economist who I would describe this way. After he got his PhD from MIT, he taught at UCLA for 3 years. He's also taught at the top Argentine universities and here at the Kennedy School in 2 stints. And last year, or for a few years in a row, he co-taught the spring macro course, API 120, for the MPAD students with me. He's pretty dedicated. Last spring, he commuted. He was an advisor to Milei at that point. He wasn't in the cabinet formally, but he commuted every week to give the lectures in class, and we're very happy to have him back again to give the ultimate lecture in the class tomorrow. He's also co-wrote a textbook that we still use in the course. Okay, so that's teaching, research. A lot of influential research. Classifying exchange rate regimes is his most well-known couple of papers, I think. He became a banker, president of the Banco Ciudad, And he, in his time there, 6 years, he made it into the most profitable state-owned company in Argentina. He is a politician. He ran for Congress successfully in 2013, served in the Chamber of Deputies for 2 years. His accomplishments there include universal preschool education and advancing reform of an undesirable attribute of social aid programs, which was that recipients would lose their benefits when they got a job. Number 5, central banker, as we heard, governor of the central bank from 2015 to 18 under President Mauricio Macri. He eliminated foreign exchange controls and adopted inflation targeting. And finally, presidential advisor. Javier Milei is quite colorful, I'm sure you know. He started advising him in 2023, first informally, then as a cabinet member. Again, his title is Minister of Deregulation and State Transformation. He's been implementing a quite radical reform agenda, cutting government regulation in a way that's more dramatic than any other example I can think of. So we're very fortunate to have him speak with us. I've got a few questions. First question that a lot of Argentine economists have to answer. Argentina was a rich country 100 years ago. In 1913, per capita income was comparable to Western Europe and among the top 10 wealthiest nations globally. So when and how did it all go wrong?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. Thanks to everybody for coming and spending these minutes with me and Jeff this afternoon. As he said, I was professor here for many years, and I never thought I was going to be on this side of the forum, so it's a real honor for me. And also, this is a stage which is actually quite relevant because many years ago, the former president of Argentina, Cristina Fernández Kirchner, came. She wasn't that used to much of getting questions, you know, so she got a little bit nervous with the questions and had some phrases which still resemble and Argentines still remember. So here we are, and happy to hear all the questions and try to answer them. There is this idea that Argentina is a kind of a country which has been on a permanent decline for the last 100 years. This idea, which is true, which is that by the beginning of the 20th century, it was one of the richest countries in the world. But I tend to focus the tragedy of Argentina in a much shorter and more recent period. And the way I illustrate that is when I was born in 1966, I was born to a country which was much richer than Spain, significantly richer than Spain. In fact, I was 10 years old, and still Argentina was richer than Spain. Spain overtook Argentina in income per capita in the mid-1970s. And today we can't actually compare our income level with that of Spain. So I think it's dramatic because the tragedy of Argentina is mostly the tragedy of our generation. It's during our lifetime we've seen the catastrophe of Argentina. And I placed the beginning of this catastrophe in the late 1960s, when there was a military government, a general which dreamed of being kind of the new Perón, and in order to pursue that political aim, he built a structure a legal structure, which basically created very significant interest groups. So, for example, he transferred a lot of money to the unions, he generated a very protective society, he generated special regimes of protection for certain industries. And the problem is that when you create those rents tend to persist over time, correct? And then the rents that are transferred to those groups are used afterwards to buy the wills to preserve the system, okay? And so Argentina built this architecture, this status quo society in the late 1960s, and which the President Milei calls this the caste system, el sistema de las castas. And Milei adds an adjective to that. He says it's not el sistema de las castas, it's el sistema empobrecedor de las castas. It's the impoverishing model of the caste. And I think that's very appropriate because I mentioned when this system was implemented in the late 1960s, Argentina was a country which was richer than Spain. it stopped growing. Our income since then has been 0.5% per year per capita growth. It's one of the worst performance in the world since then. But in the late 1960s, we had a 5% poverty rate. And when Milei took over his presidency, the poverty rate was above 50%. So that's why Milei says this is the impoverishing model of the caste. So you say, when did Argentina get messed up? I think Argentina got messed up with us, with our generation, and over the last 50 years has been the real catastrophe. And I think Milei is the first real and effective challenge to this system in 50 years, and therefore the first real possibility of a significant change.
Okay, so tell us about the chainsaw and particularly the story of how you wrote out a detailed blueprint for reform.
Yeah. Okay. So you see, here I have my chainsaw pin. Okay, which everybody in my ministry wears. By the way, we buy this with our own money. Eh? We don't use government money for this. Okay. So I just want to be clear. I would say that I'm the Minister of Deregulation and State Reform. I remember we were thinking about the name of the ministry. Javier Milei says, how about we call it the Minister of Modernization? I say, well, not really, because the state doesn't modernize. The state brings us backwards. So it could be a Ministry of Backwardation, which I don't think would be very appealing. Okay, so it's more about deregulation, which is also not simplification, because when you're looking at this structure, maybe it's not a question of simplifying things. It's questioning yourself whether that structure should be there altogether. So we ask a more basic question. So deregulation is one of the themes, and then state reform, which is the chainsaw, is. So you want me to start with the chainsaw, correct?
Yeah.
So I'll start with the chainsaw, which is the state reform. So the chainsaw is kind of, we tend to think, Milei has one idea, which is that something is going to change in Argentina, and what's going to change is that Argentina is going to have a fiscal surplus. Period. No condition is nothing. Fiscal surplus, always. With a twist, because he says we're going to achieve that fiscal surplus not through an increase in taxes, but through a reduction in government expenditures. We tend to think that what most of the things government does are useless, so you better reduce government expenditure rather than collect more taxes to finance that expenditure. That's the chainsaw. The chainsaw is the reduction in government expenditure. In the first year, we have chainsaw 1.0 and we have chainsaw 2.0. So let me start with chainsaw 1.0, which is what we did in the first year. In the first year, he reduced government expenditure 30%. He closed a budget deficit of 5% of GDP in his first month. Okay, people thought that was impossible, including here, your servant. But I asked the finance minister, how did you achieve this? And he said, well, each time I went to see Javier and I suggested something, Javier said, oh, this is great, but do it twice as big, okay? So that certainly helped. And so he reduced government expenditure 30%. It was a reduction of government expenditure by 5%. And I think there are three reflections that I think I would like to share here, which I think interesting. I don't know how much each one of these things I'm going to say translate to other countries, but you'll see what it is, and you can make up your own mind. The first thing is about the size and speed with which you can do a fiscal adjustment. I talked to political candidates in other countries which call me to see what's going on with Milei, and they say, oh, I have a fiscal deficit of 4%, maybe I can reduce 1% per year, so I end my term with a fiscal balance. I say, oh, 1% per year, why don't you do 5% in 1 month? And they say, no, that's impossible. Well, but that's what Milei did. And that forces you to think a little bit out of the box. Milei touched things which I thought were untouchable, and he said, no, we're going to get rid of this, and we got rid of them, and not only nothing happened, but we achieved this fiscal surplus very quickly. So I think he has reframed the discussion on what has to be done. Maybe we were just not creative enough. We were not rebellious enough. We were not bold enough in thinking about what could be done and what could not be done. The second thing is that there's a little bit of something that probably everybody would have thought, that if you do a 5% fiscal adjustment, you maybe are going to take a hit on the economy. The economy is going to suffer. Well, we didn't think that was going to be the case at all. In fact, there was a famous professor here at the Harvard Econ Department, Alberto Alesina, who had worked on this looking at fiscal stabilizations in Europe. And he found that fiscal adjustments, which were implemented through a reduction in government expenditure, tended to be expansionary from an economic point of view. Why? Because if you reduce government expenditure, you reduce taxes, because everything that the government spends, someone has to pay for it. I mean, the money doesn't come up from out of thin air. So if you reduce government expenditure, you reduce taxes. And if you may have a negative output effect of the reduction in the government expenditure, you definitely have an expansionary output effect from the reduction in taxes, because when you reduce taxes, people have a larger disposable income and they spend more. So you have a phenomenon of crowding in of private consumption. So he reduced government expenditure 5%. What happened to the economy? The economy grew 6%. Not only did not fall, it grew 6%. So there was an increase in the spending for the private sector of 11 points, correct? 5 plus 6. But what was the most important? How did this happen? This happened because by reducing expenditure, he reduced the inflation tax. This was the most important tax that he reduced. And he reducing the inflation tax, he reduced a tax on the poor, mostly. And by doing this reduction in government expenditure, this chainsaw, and reducing the inflation tax, he got 10 million Argentines out of poverty. The poverty rate fell by 20 points. Okay, so there was no. So I think we have to revisit that idea that a fiscal adjustment is going to be costly in terms of output. I think it's wrong. I think the theory doesn't say that that's what's going to happen, and I think this is an example, quite dramatic example, where that didn't happen. And the third, which actually ties with this last thing I was saying, is people said, well, if you do a fiscal adjustment of 5% of GDP, it's going to cost you, maybe it doesn't cost you in output, but it's going to cost you in popularity, okay? That's also tremendously wrong. Because if you cut the expenditure which people perceive as corruption, which you perceive as useless. People were paying for something, they were getting nothing in exchange for that. So you actually said, someone which gets I think the expression, el toro por las astas, someone gets the bull by its horns, correct? And finally has decided that it's going to reduce this. So, and imagine, if in addition to that, you take 10 million people out of poverty, how can that be an unpopular move? So I think that the chainsaw has been dramatic in its implementation, and it has been surprising in its effect, at least surprising, perhaps not for us, because we did it because we believe this is what's going to happen, but certainly surprising for conventional wisdom, okay? Just a small word and we finish with chainsaw. Now we move to chainsaw 2.0, okay? So what is chainsaw 2? Because we did this 30% adjustment, and then President Milei got us in the cabinet and said, guys, now start, okay, doing the correction of the fiscal. And so I said, well, we need a framework. So we spent the whole cabinet meeting doing the exercise of deciding what should a libertarian government do. So we made a list of the yes, and we did a list of the no's. So now my chainsaw men and women are going around the government and say, oh, what do you do? Are you in the yes or in the no's? If you're in the yes, fine, and if you're in the no's, you go, correct? So every peso we save with a chainsaw is 1 peso less of taxes that we're going to charge people. And this is the fundamental reason why we do it. We want a smaller state, a cheaper state, and we want more of the GDP to be spent by people freely, and not having people pay the state something, taxes, so that the state decides how their money is going to be spent. So we believe that the best way for people to spend their money is that they spend them themselves, and this is why we believe in a smaller state.
So that's mostly macroeconomics. So I'd like you to give us some examples of specific regulations which you cut, and just tell us a story about how you wrote out the detailed plan for deregulating before the election.
Okay, so the change was one thing, no? And that would be the state reform part. And then you have the deregulation. The deregulation is economic freedom. The president believes that the freer the people are, the more they are in the market to serve the rest of the people. They're not to trick the rest of the people. They were a very Adam Smith idea, correct, of the invisible hand. So we want to kind of take away the state from the middle. Now, to get the state out of the middle now is implementation. I mean, it's a great idea, but now we have to get it done, correct? And as I was saying, at the end of the 1960s, there was a legal architecture that was built to build this status quo society. So if you want to change this, you need to destroy this legal architecture. Well, destroy maybe is a phrase which is perhaps a bit too strong, but you need to undermine, you need to kind of take apart very significant parts of this. I come from previous experiences of governments which try to implement reform and fail. So, failure is very edifying, it's very educating. And so I thought a lot about why these other governments had failed. And I realized they failed because they had not attempted to change this architecture. You had to go to the bones, you had to get to the structure. So 2 years before Milei was elected, I decided to start a project to review the whole of Argentina's laws. Okay, so I put together, I decided I was going to read every law of Argentina, and well, maybe not myself, absolutely everything, okay, I'm not so, okay, so, soberbio, como
so
se dice?
masochistic.
No masochistic, no, soberbio, no person can do that, okay, on its own, but so I put together a team which was 4 law students, look at this story, 4 law students at the Universidad de San Andrés, where I was teaching. A very senior constitutional law professor from Universidad de San Andrés, myself, I was a professor at San Andrés, and my TA from Eco One, okay? This guy is the chainsaw man now, okay? And anyway, so our budget was 0, okay? And we started reading the laws and saying what should stay, what should be repealed completely, and what should be modified. And when we thought something needed to be modified in the sense of taking out all the structure, it was easy to identify this structure of privileges and restrictions to competition and privileges that were being built in the law. And perhaps the most interesting part of my method, I think, is that at some point we needed help from someone, because we also couldn't do everything. And I had to come and teach at the Kennedy School and things. I mean, I had to do other stuff. I had to earn my living, correct? And so I would ask for help from someone, okay? So let's imagine environmental laws. So I called someone and said, can you give me a help with, I look for someone who is kind of like-minded. I call, okay, and then the person would say, I'm going to send you a paper on environmental law. And I said, you send me a paper, I'm not going to read it. Oh, you're not going to read it, so what do you want? I said, we can do a meeting, I can explain. No, sorry, I don't do meetings. Do you want some bullets? I don't read bullets. So what the hell do you want, okay? No, what I want you to do is I said, I don't know, what problem do we have? We have the air law, the water law, the glaciers law. Okay, do we have a problem with it? Oh yeah, we have a problem with this law. Okay, download the law and then put it in a Word file, and with track changes, just write the changes that you think you would like to be implemented. And I need the thing that I need the politicians, that the politician can work on. Because to have a diagnosis, a story, I mean, the politician on their own, they can build a story, okay? They need what they need to do to change reality. So my only end product was not a diagnosis of the situation. We already know what the diagnosis is. We were in trouble, okay? The diagnosis is very simple. We need to know how we're going to change the situation. So I need the paper to put on the table. I need the change in the law. Now, the interesting thing is that when I got to this point of the conversation and people realized that the only thing I was going to take was the edited text of the law, 70% of the people disappeared. So a lot of people said, oh, I want to help you. I said, okay, take law 24506 and 23788 and send them back to me edited. I never heard back from them, okay? But the important thing is, so 30% of the people took up the challenge and did it. So it was very easy for me to identify, without me spending a lot of time, who are the people who are going to help me or not. And so basically with about 100 people on and off, we got the job done in about a year and a half. And by the end of the presidential campaign, we had 2 piles of papers. One pile were all the laws that had to be repealed, eliminated. And then we had a big, large pile of paper of all the laws that we had written changes to the laws, correct? And for the politicians, they need what needs to be done to transform reality. So I had actually worked this for another presidential candidate, and when she lost and Javier Milei went to the ballotage, we jointly decided to show this work to Javier. And we had a very long meeting, which lasted 6 hours. We went over the main themes of the project, and boy, did he get excited, okay? And that became an executive decree, I mean, with additional input from the other ministers, of course, and the whole team. But it became a very significant part of an executive decree that we launched 10 days into his government, where we did a very sweeping deregulation reform of the economy. And then we sent to Congress 10 days later a very significant bill called the Basis Law, which we entertained Congress 7 months discussing it, and eventually was passed in July. And the day after the law was passed, I swore as deregulation minister. So it had a method, it had a methodology, it had a purpose. I was very clear about what we needed to put on the table to implement reform. You don't want to get to the government and then start thinking about what changes you have to do, because then it's going to take you 2 years until you actually get the whole thing identified, or you're just going to focus on a few things. And if you focus on a few things, you're never going to have the breadth and the scope that the Milei reforms achieved in this year and a half.
So give us 1 or 2 examples of specific regulations that were inefficient, that needed to be removed or modified.
Yeah, I mean, you have all. I tend to give a few examples which are very significant. For example, we had a rent-controlled law, and we eliminated completely the rent control. We decided that people could sign the contracts in the currency they wanted, for the time they wanted, in the way they wanted, to be paid in the way they wanted, and everything. And everybody was scared, that was going to create I mean, freedom sometimes is frightening, it seems like, and the only thing that happened is that the real price of rentals came down 30%. The supply of rentals increased dramatically in the big cities of Argentina. And
how fast?
Extremely fast, extremely fast. I would say that the reduction in 30% was, you could see it in 3 or 4 months, and it was kind of a big initial, very significant hit for the government. I'll tell you, another example is that it was difficult in Argentina to do satellite internet. And Argentina is the obvious country for satellite internet, because it's a very big country geographically, but it's very thinly populated. So, and people are all around, and so it's very costly to get a fiber cable, no, optic fiber cable to everybody, no. So satellite, and it was forbidden. Of course, it was forbidden because it was lobby from the local providers of internet. They didn't want competition, so they had lobbied the communications authority to forbid satellite internet. So we also in the decree we eliminated that. And perhaps the most visible application was Starlink started operating in Argentina. You can get internet everywhere. In fact, even in the city of Buenos Aires, where obviously the cable optic, the fiber cable is more competitive than the satellite, the system is totally clogged. We have to ask Elon to put more satellites, because they're not selling more links, because there's no more capacity for the satellites that are currently over the city of Buenos Aires. So that has been a tremendous success, because people who were uncommunicated in the country, and it cost nothing. That's the most amazing thing, which is that the previous government had spent $7 billion in a state-owned company to deploy fiber cable across the country, $7 billion. And I'm not saying that that's going to go to waste, because it has some value. But honestly, now people just they get directly from the internet, no? So it's dramatic. And then you get some. I have a few funny stories that I tell a lot. So someone is listening or is watching in Argentina, probably they've heard me say this already. But I have a story which is very funny, which is, I like to tell it because it illustrates the absurdity of the regulation. So I've opened up my email, correct? And I say, people write to me and tell me how the state is making your life miserable. And we have also set up the problem is that in my email, people would write and they would write the history of their lives. So, those very long emails. And sometimes they said, oh, customs is a mess. And I can't do much with that, okay? Because we have 700,000 decrees and we don't even know what our laws are. So if they say it's a mess, I don't know where to start, correct? So we set up a website where we ask people to give us the specific norm which is bothering them, and we have 12,000 recommendations. A lot of the work we're doing now is based on that, so it's very... So one day a guy writes to me and, a hilarious thing. For example, the guy says, look, I import LEDs, which are 12 volts, okay? And the previous government established that you had to get an electricity security certificate to see if you were not going to be killed by electricity of the 12 volt, okay, which is totally ridiculous because nothing can happen with 12 volts. But the most funny story I have is a guy calls me and says, I need help with my watermelons. And I say, what's the problem with your watermelons? They don't taste good. And they say, no, they taste great. In fact, I'm an exporter of watermelon. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the Food and Drug Administration asked me to package the watermelons in a specific way, which is not the way my client abroad wants them to be packaged. So I've been trying to convince the Food and Drug Administration that I want to package the watermelons the way I can sell the watermelons. And the guy says, no, the regulation says you have to package it this way, you have to package it this way, okay? I've been 10 years fighting for this. And he says, Federico, but watermelons are not plutonium, They're not uranium. They're not dangerous. They don't contaminate. They can go bad, but it's not, that's my problem, not anybody else's problem. So I don't see why the guys are so, okay. And so he says, the solution I'm implementing right now is that when I put the watermelons on the boat and the boat leaves the port of Argentina, I send a smaller boat with 60 guys, and they get on the boat, and then they unpack, break all the packages, and then they repackage the watermelons, okay? I've been doing this for the last 5 years, but please, help me with this, okay? And I turned around to my team and I say, I think this is true. Because if I try to imagine this, I cannot, okay? So it has to be true. It has to be true. And so I put in the website, I put SENASA packages, okay? SENASA is our Food and Drug Administration. And then I get this whole thing, 200 pages telling you how you should package the pineapples, which you have to use little pieces of wood of 5 centimeters, and the box cannot be taller than 15. This is all gone, by the way. And then the berries, and then the this and that. My brain exploded, of course. I couldn't finish, and okay, we got rid of all that, But really, it was kind of, the guy had pointed out to the tip of the iceberg, because once I started looking at all the fruit production, I realized that it was much more which was beyond the eyesight. For example, people could not start harvesting the fruit before a government official told them, now you can start. And then I realized that the Food and Drug Administration was not only a control of the sanitary, why do you want to have an administration to supervise the production of fruit? Because you may have a plague. And if someone has a plague, you don't want that plague to spread out. And but they had become a control of the production technique. They were controlling the quality of the products. And we think that it's the customer which has to control the quality of the product, not the government official. So basically, it was funny because I printed all the regulations of fruit production. It was 1.5 kilos, like 3 pounds of paper. It was a pile like this. So I said, oh, you need first a PhD in literature to read all this, and then you can become a fruit producer, okay? So anyway, I talked to the Food and Drug Administration official and say, what should we do with fruit? And he said 2 things. We need to know who's producing, because if I have a sanitary event, and I can look which producers are producing, so I can work with them and contain the plague. And then I have to also to provide the certificates when you export fruit, because you don't want the Chinese to open a container Or in Miami, to open a container with oranges and they're all contaminated with some flies or whatever because they're going to close it and close the market for Argentina. Okay, anything else? Nothing else. I had the big pile in the back of my office. Okay, so I wrote a regulation which was only those two things, which was 80 grams. Okay, so my regulations from fruit went from 1.5 kilos to 80 grams. But I think that kind of goes back to this idea of don't simplify what you have. Don't simplify the 1.5 kilos of paper, because if you try trimming that 1.5 kilos, maybe you get it down to 1.2 kg. But you have to ask yourself, is all this thing had any meaning, any purpose, any usefulness? And really it didn't have, so we got off it altogether. But I think that's kind of you want an example? That's the one it's kind of a symbol of the work we've been doing, because I think it shows the absurdity of the whole thing.
So what's an example of, let's stipulate that a lot of these regulations were silly, the satellite reception or the watermelons, and that eliminating them helped almost everybody, or helped lots of people, but some interest group that had been protected that you don't really want to protect. But do you have examples of collateral damage, people that you would be sympathetic with who were hurt by some of this?
Well, to the extent that that regulation is to a great extent pushed by interest groups, whenever you do a deregulation, it's like, Mancur Olson. I mean, there was this scientist which says the logic of collective action. A concentrated interest, they manage to lobby more effectively than dispersed interest. So we're kind of going that in reverse, okay? So when you deregulate, you affect a concentrated interest and you benefit the population at large, no? And so really, I mean, you don't feel that sympathetic to someone who has created through the law a privilege for itself and has really charged the Argentine population 2 or 3 times a product. And now it's difficult to get across. No, for example, we have a fantastic product in Argentina which is yerba mate. I don't know. I know there are some Argentines here, but it's something like not as awful as Fernet, but it's a very interesting beverage, extremely successful in Argentina. 96% of the families consume this product. So I said, well, if you have an industry which is so successful to almost have universal, you have 8 billion people out in the world to convince them to consume this product, correct? Yet the industry had generated restrictions of 2 sorts. First, in Argentina, when you have a monopoly, you have competition, you create a government institution to transform it into a monopoly, okay? So for example, here you have an industry which has lots of producers, lots of brands, different size companies. They created a national institute to set the price, okay, because they didn't tolerate the competition. And so in the decree, we decided to eliminate this institute, and then we stopped setting the price for this product. And the other restriction this industry had was that it was forbidden to plant. So the industry was forbidden from growing. And it's obvious, no? You protect the current producer and you hurt the future producers, okay? And that's the logic of Mancur Olson. The future producers cannot be hurt. They don't even exist, okay? But as a policymaker, you need to think about the dynamic effect of an industry and the potential of the industry to grow. So the price of this product has fallen 40% in real terms since the deregulation. More or less, when you deregulate something, iron, rentals, satellite, yerba, the price is almost kind of, for some reason, between 30 and 40% of the changes in the prices downwards. And there, there has been some issues in the producing areas of yerba. And it's difficult, because you have to say, well, it's 48 million people which were paying this subsidy, and why should the state come and say, oh, these people have to pay this subsidy to this industry? And why is the industry trying to, instead of actually going out after the 8 billion people that can consume the product, they're going after the Argentine consumer and charging them a price which is basically twice as much as what it should be, no? So when you go against interest groups, you tend not to be very sympathetic to those who complain, okay? In fact, sometimes I say, if they don't complain, that means I'm not doing my job, correct? I need to hear a little bit thunder to know that I'm on the right track.
All right, it's almost time to turn to the audience for Q&A, but I want to squeeze in two last questions.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that the need for reform of this magnitude might be unique to Argentina? Argentina might be unique in this way.
Well, certainly the need for this in Argentina is huge. It's geological layers of regulations. If you ask me, I think it's pretty common in the rest of the world, probably with different intensity. When you look at Europe, Europe actually has 2 layers, because now Europe is captured by the regulations of their own country, and then on top you've put the whole layer of the European Union regulations. And certainly in Latin America, I'm sure this is a very significant part of the agenda. Some countries probably less, some countries probably more. There is a little bit of this thing about deregulation in the world. It has become a little bit more popular over the last year. In fact, even the IMF, Georgieva has created a small committee on deregulation. She has asked me to be part of that, and she thinks that this is a very significant piece of the agenda going forward. So certainly I think it's much more universal than Argentina.
Okay, last question. Your president seems to like being identified with President Trump and Elon Musk. He lent them the image of the chainsaw. So do you think they're useful analogies between what's going on in the two countries?
Well, I've never spoken to Elon, unfortunately, because I'm a big fan. I also think the social value of Elon is not in Doji, but I'd rather have him doing the rockets, okay, and Tesla. But it is true that he spoke several times with President Milei, and President Milei told him what we were doing in the deregulation ministry and the general agenda that he was pursuing of economic freedom in general. And this is a guess, okay, that I have, but I think that at some point, because if you read Elon Musk's biography, it's very clear that the deregulation issue was very much in his mind. No? There's a quote that I like to mention in his book, where they're discussing the launches of the first rockets, no? And then someone says, well, before we do the launch, we have to do this test A, B, C, and D. And then Elon says, well, could you please point to the engineer who has suggested this launches so I can proceed to his firing. And so everybody's kind of very nervous. Says, no, NASA is asking for these things, and NASA is footing the bill. So we need to do this because the client is asking for this. Oh, now I realize why the rockets cost $2 billion instead of $200 million, because you have to put all these safeguards. You know, NASA has this phrase, failure is not an option, and failure is not an option is, you would never do a business plan where failure is not an option, because the number of contingencies that you would do would make the business unprofitable. So if you have to make the rocket with all these contingencies, it will be 10 times heavier, it will take 10 times more years to build, it will be 10 times weighter, and it will not fly, okay? So you'll spend a lot of money and it will not work. So when you read that in his biography, you realize that over-regulation was something that and that's talking about the US. because I think the US is much less regulated than countries like Europe, no? Or even some Latin American countries. And were telling me in Chile, for example, to do a mining project today, it's virtually impossible. I mean, the amount of paperwork and things that you have to go through. And but I think he had never connected with the idea that you could pursue that agenda from within. And I think from his conversations with Milei, he got the idea, this is a guess, okay, that maybe it made sense to try it from within the US government to attempt this regulation. Now, just looking from afar, what I see is that in these two dimensions of the deregulation and the state reform, as Elon Musk started working in Doji, he got much more involved in the chainsaw part, in the state reform, than in the deregulation. He didn't put his focus on cleaning up regulations, but all this kind of useless spending in the U.S. government, which are the things that we've seen in the news that he's been identifying. So I would say that you have deregulation and you have chainsaw. I think he's focused on chainsaw, and well, I think both agendas are important.
Okay, we're going to turn to the audience now for questions. We have 4 mics, one here, and two higher up. Ask a question, don't give a lecture. You are encouraged to state your name and where you are at the school if you want to, but you don't have to.
I can start. Hello, Professor.
All right.
I stole the place from you. Hello, professors. You both taught me macroeconomics last year. I'm a second year in PhD. You know how passionate I am about macro because Argentinian. We have PTSD. And I wanted to ask, it's great that you lifted capital controls, but don't you think that the exchange rate is too appreciated and that can damage the industries while the economy is opening?
Well, here you see the fear of freedom. It's kind of in the blood, correct? After so many years we spent most of our years with capital controls. I think a few weeks ago, the finance minister, I tend not to speak about the macro issues because we have this disagreement with the finance minister. I think in macro there has to be a unified and unique voice for the government, but about a month ago, probably already, or 3 weeks ago, he decided to lift capital controls. The exchange rate is floating freely without central bank intervention within a band. It's kind of a widening band, so we assure that we move to a more significant float. I think you have basically you have a fiscal surplus, you have a totally constrained monetary policy. There's no way the exchange rate can go. You let it float, which is so you have all the benefits of the strength of the monetary regime with the necessary flexibility that you need in an economy like Argentina, which is subject to external shocks. It's not a very large economy. So I think it's absolutely fantastic, the scheme that it has implemented. Certainly, like 2 years ago, we had very low wages in dollars. I mean, everybody wanted to escape the country. There was not a single investment. So the real exchange rate was much more appreciated. So certainly it has much more depreciated. So it has certainly appreciated. But I don't think having the lowest wages in Latin America was an equilibrium situation for Argentina, and it was a standard situation. It was just. So I don't think we should compare us to that situation because I think that was the situation which was off equilibrium, not necessarily this one. But let me add to this, to your worries, in the following sense that Argentina is in the middle of an energy boom. And probably if things turn out pretty well and Javier secures a second mandate, it's going to be followed by a mining boom. Imagine that we share the Andes with Chile. Andes exports how many $1 billion in mining? How many, Pablo? 30 billion. We export 3. So imagine the scope that we have we export about $60-70 billion. But we basically have the second largest reserves in the world of shale gas. And we're gonna be a world-class exporter. That's a process which is already a few months ago. YPF, which is our largest oil company, signed one deal for export of LNG, and it was equivalent of 10% of Argentine exports, just one deal. And so I think Argentina is having this export boom, and the export boom tends to appreciate the real exchange rate. So, but for the good reasons, correct? It's not an export boom which happens because you have short-term capital flow, money coming in. It's because you're producing more tradables, and it's a real thing. So I think Argentina has to use this export boom to strongly open up the economy and move to an economy which today exports 10% of GDP and imports 10% GDP, to be an economy that exports 30% of GDP and imports 30% of GDP. No? So, and I think if you have a lot of supply of dollars from the exports and you don't have any demand for exports because there are no imports, then the pressures for the appreciation of the exchange rate will be even stronger, correct? Because you get the exports and you don't get the imports. So I think that's why I say in order to save the industry, you have to open the economy to create a countervailing force to the increase in exports that you're going to get. And I think Argentina is going to have a tremendous increase in industrial production, but it's going to be an industrial production which is going to be based on the true comparative advantage of Argentina, which are going to be energy. The Neuquén basin is going to be one of the places in the world with the cheapest energy, where natural gas is going to be sold at a fraction of what you'll pay for it in Europe. And so I think it's very easy for me to imagine a very significant increase of industrial production in Argentina in energy-intensive industries associated to this new complex. So,
all right, we've got 10 people waiting to ask questions,
okay.
and we're supposed to stop at 7.
I'll be shorter.
Well, it's all very interesting. We'll have to close off the list. If you're not already in line, don't get in line. And I'm not. We'll try to move through as fast as we can, get as many as you can.
I'll be shorter.
Thank you very much. I'm José Ignacio, MPA ID from Chile. Federico, has been amazing all the changes that you have done, dismantling the rents of interest groups. How can you ensure that these regulations will not reverse back, or these groups don't fight back in the future, and these changes will be like sustainable over the time?
Okay,
Thank you very much.
So this is the French Revolution, correct? And when Louis XVI faced the French Revolution, there were two interest groups that he had to support, or supported him, which were the clergy and were the landowners, correct? And their power emanated from the fact that they had land, so they were rich. So that's what it meant. So what did the French Revolution do, in addition to cutting their head off, which is not kind of in the plans, okay, of anybody. But they took away the land. And when they took away the land from the clergy and they took away the land from the landowners, their economic power was diminished and their force as an actor. And those were the ancien regimes. Those were the guys which were dangerous from the French Revolution, because to the extent that they kept their power, they were going to try to push the economy back to the ancien regime. So Argentina, I have an expression which says that Argentina is drowning in its own Bermuda triangles. And what you have in the angles of the triangles are the unions, which would be kind of our modern version of the clergy. And then you have part of the business community, which were the beneficiaries of this system that I explained before, that had been built in the late 60s. Not all the business community, but part of it. So those would be the landowners. And then the Peronist Party is Louis XVI, okay? So the Peronist Party is the caretaker of this statu quo regime. And so I'm going to sleep and be sure that Argentina has changed definitely once I realize that the economic power of these forces which want us to go back to the ancien regime has been weakened, okay? Which means that the finances of the unions have been weakened and the rents of these business sectors which tried to go back to the ancien regime have eliminated. That's why I think that's an interesting distinction that I make, is that all the reforms have like a two-layer. They have an economic layer, which is what we teach here, well, we also teach here the second layer, the Kennedy School, and the second layer is the political layer. So when I say I'm going to do competition policies, because we think the market is going to work better, as I mentioned, the prices come down, but it also weakens the rents of the ancien regime. It's like taking away the land from the landowners, the competition, because it eliminates the rents, okay? So the only way, of course, the president is being successful. Hopefully he'll have a second term. We'll consolidate. Things will go well, and then society will understand the benefits of these reforms. But I'm gonna sleep soundly and nicely when I know that the financial power of the ancien regime has been destroyed.
All right, take a question up here.
Yeah.
Let's try to move along briskly.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Professor. I'll try to be quick. I'm Nicholas, a first-year MPID, so learning macro from Professor Frankel and would have otherwise learned from you. My question, I think a lot of us are still itching to understand better to what extent this has external validity for our countries, be that the US and Doge, or just other countries that we're from, Europe, Latin America, and so on. And so my question is specifically, what are the things that you seem to be getting right that you haven't seen done right elsewhere? I'm thinking of a specific example, but I'd love to hear if there are other ones that come to mind for you, specifically around state capture as you try to change the regulations. We've seen with Doge that, in some situations, kind of, Musk-affiliated organizations seem to have preferential treatment. Are you encountering the same problems kind of at this political layer, and are there other things that...
Okay, no, I would like to mention something about that, which is that X, formerly known as Twitter, okay? It's a tremendous, powerful tool for the president to push the agenda. Okay, we have a president which has no interest, correct? He's an outsider, he's an economist. He said that after his second term, he's going to go back to his dogs. And I think that gives him a lot of credibility that he's in here to do so. That's very important because people believe that the purpose of the mandate is to correct this system that for 50 years has taken the poverty rate to 50%. Well, already it's come down 20 points, no? So, for example, imagine I go and I say I'm going to deregulate something, okay? And, of course, there's someone who's going to try to fight me against the deregulation. So that's why sometimes I tend not to anticipate what I'm doing, so I avoid the hassle of... But imagine that I do, okay? And then it gets in the newspapers. And immediately gets in the newspaper, the President Milei retweets the thing. And that has a tremendous effect, because when he retweets, I say, I'm going to deregulate this industry, and the President is supporting this publicly, then the lobby against this says, what am I going to do if already the President has stated his view? And so I tell the President that he's very supportive of his ministers, tremendously supportive, and he gives us freedom and gives us his total trust, and I think that makes the government very effective. But I say, with your support, in addition to strengthening us and then allowing us to do our job better, it's like you're clearing my path, because I move with my reform agenda, and it's like you're walking ahead of me, clearing my path, because you're basically, by stating your support, you basically avoid the, let's say, the pushback, correct, from the interest. So perhaps in going to the other experiences, I think if you don't have the kind of political will, the political commitment, and the ability to communicate that publicly in the way the President does, I think that's a tremendous ingredient. Without that ingredient, my effectiveness would be nil. So perhaps this is perhaps you say state capture. He doesn't have that problem, but on the contrary, he's helping us push this agenda very, very significantly.
So it's 6:59. Hopefully we can run over a little bit up here.
Hello, thank you so much. My name is Anna Christina, and I'm from Norway, also MPID. I have two quick questions. One is, what is on the reform agenda going forward? What do you think will be the most impactful for Argentina that you still plan to do?
Yes.
And secondly, I'm curious about your own philosophy. Do you see yourself as a libertarian? Have you been that your whole life? And also, what is it that motivates you most about freedom and otherwise?
I've been a libertarian most of my life. I'm a true believer in freedom. I think I've never changed in that. It's a dream for me because I lived in a country which was very opposed to those ideas. What's coming in the agenda, perhaps with more force, is the issue of labor reform. Because Argentina, now, when you have an economy with high inflation, the labor market is very flexible because inflation makes it flexible, because you don't have rigidities downwards. It's just a question, you have inflation 10% and you adjust wages 5%. So the market, but when you have total stability, which I think is the situation we're moving into right now, labor reform is very significant. I think one thing, we've already done half of what has to be done in the basis law, which is that we solved all the uncertainties associated to severance and firing, etc. We've reduced the uncertainty. But then we have a problem with our labor laws, which is that Argentina has negotiations which are national and sectorial. So this means, so let me give you an example from Italy. If in Italy, the metal workers make an agreement, which is great for Milan, but in Calabria, you can't fire anybody. In Calabria, you can't hire anybody because the wage is totally off. So, okay. I think maybe our time is up or something. So anyway, so in Germany, for example, the negotiations are more local. So you have provinces with higher productivity, have higher wages. In Argentina, for example, we have the whole northwest of Argentina, which is has a structural problem in the labor market, and that's because the negotiation imposes the same wage across the country. So I think that most important piece of the labor reform which is missing is that we need to have the flexibility so that firms at the firm level can deviate from the national agreement to do a wage agreement. And the other thing that I think is absolutely critical is that Argentina opens up. Argentina has a tremendously closed economy. If you go to Argentina even still today, in spite of what we've achieved in the last year and a half, you'll be surprised by how close the economy is. And I think we need to have a more open economy. So I think those are the two big things on the agenda.
So do we have to stop or can we run over?
One more. Last question.
One more, okay.
Thank you so much, Federico. You mentioned many different regulations that you want to get rid of. I wanted to ask you, how do you actually prioritize which regulation do you want to go forward? And then how do you actually track the impact of that regulation over economic output? It could be prices or other things.
Yeah, we look at prices, but we don't spend too much time tracking, because if we spend time tracking, we don't spend time deregulating. So I said, okay, will I let other private sector parties analyze this, or MPAIT students in their SIPA projects? And now remember, I had reviewed the whole laws of Argentina, and I did not prioritize it. I'm going to see the whole thing, and that already gives me some. I already know where let's say the pain points are, and that gives me one. Then, as I told you before, we look at what people tell us, so that's also very revealing. And then the third element that I use is price differentials. So, for example, if I see a product which sells in Argentina at the same price as in the rest of the world, maybe I don't focus on that area that much. But for example, if I say the mouth and hoof disease vaccine, which in Argentina is $1.10 and in Paraguay it costs 35 cents on the dollar, then I know I have a problem there and I have to act on that. Okay, so the price differentials are also an element which helps me prioritize where to look at. And so far we've been working on it ties up with the previous question. We've been working more on cleaning up the system. My whole work was cleaning the system, not building something new. And I think, for example, when we think about labor reform or a new tax system, maybe after the economic stabilization has been achieved, after the first wave of deregulation has been achieved, then I think we have to start with some structural questions like how is the labor market going to look, how is our openness going to look, how our trade policy is going to look, and how is our tax system going to look. So I think that is, we're moving to a more structural reform agenda after kind of this big impulse of macroeconomic stabilization and deregulation.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time, and people have a lot more questions, but we're going to have to stop there. Join me in thanking Federico Sturzenegger.